Welcome to episode 20 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. Today's episode is all about chair pose or utkatasana. As many of our listeners surely know, chair pose is lots of people's least favorite pose. And so we're going to take a look at the reasons why that might be the case from an anatomical and biomechanical standpoint. So we'll break down what muscles are involved and what joints are involved and how the alignment, people tend to say it has to be one way. And so we'll take a look at some of the things that like the rules that people make about it, such as the knees not going past the toes and tucking the tailbone or untucking the tailbone and lots more alignment based questions. So and then after that, we'll talk about how it is a challenging pose, but there are, from both a strength and mobility standpoint, but there are ways that we can work on our strength and mobility, maybe inside of a yoga context or outside of a yoga context, to make it a bit easier. So, Jenny, my first question for you is, could you just kind of give a very general description of what chair pose is, and then maybe some of the different variations that chair pose can take?
Yes, absolutely. So chair pose, super common pose that we tend to see in yoga classes everywhere. And I think that the best way that I could describe it just in a super general sense is you start standing, which is like tadasana or mountain pose. You start standing and you basically just sit down toward the floor, but not all the way down to the floor. But it's like you might picture that you're about to sit down into a seat or into a chair, like therefore the name coming from chair.
Is that why they call it chair? Because you're imagining that you're sitting into a chair, or is it because you look a little bit like a chair?
That's a really good question. How would that? Is there a difference between those two?
I guess when you're in a chair, you look like a chair.
Right.
But well, should you imagine that you're sitting into a chair, or should you imagine being a chair?
I think that could be a little open to this is in my understanding. I think it could be a little open to interpretation. I rarely have seen someone explain it that you should think of yourself looking like a chair.
Be the
But
chair.
there are a lot of yoga poses where
I'm
we
gonna
do
try
name
that.
things to like because of how they look. You should try. I mean, it might make a difference. I just think that's really funny. But in my mind, it's more about the action or the position of like you're sitting down into a chair. So it's kind of like trying to embody what your body would do in that instance. So starting standing, and then you just lower down some amount toward the floor. Like I said, not like all the way down to the floor, but toward the idea of being in a chair. And what that would mean is if you started standing, then basically you could think of pretty much all of your major joints of their body being neutral. But if you start to lower your body down as though you were either going to look like a chair or as though you were sitting in a chair, then movement would be happening at some of our major joints. So you might think about like your knees would start to bend, your hips would start to flex, hip flexion. For most people, there would be movement at the ankles too. So like as your knees track forward, that necessarily means that your ankles are going to move into a direction called dorsiflexion. Your torso, so like, the mid and upper body, it may start to hinge forward a certain degree. And and also I forgot to say that in chair pose in yoga, we typically take our arms up. So shoulders up overhead into shoulder flexion. So that would be a difference between actually looking like a chair or sitting in a chair. We don't generally sit down in a chair like at the dinner table with our arms reaching up overhead, although we could. But so that's the difference there. So chair pose is like, if you just sum it up, that's how I think you could think of it. But obviously all bodies are different, and there are also different ways that we might place different emphases on the movement in the pose, so that the specific movement at all of those joints that I mentioned, it might differ depending on how we're doing it in the moment. Does that make sense though? Just that general idea?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So then what are some of the variations of chair? So you just described your basic chair pose. Well, wait, should we get into this now? So you mentioned like you descend. Um,
Right.
the what would you say would be like the quintessential depth to which one would descend?
That's a good
And
question.
obviously, that's a can of worms. But if we were
Right,
to
right.
describe the most general pose the way that in light on yoga,
Yeah. Oh, I don't have I should have looked
oh
in Light on
man,
Yoga to
you should
see.
just bring the book from now on.
I think you're totally right to all of our recordings.
You can
Yes.
refer to it for all of our questions.
Absolutely. We'll do that. We'll do that in the future. But I think if most yoga students had their way, they would embody a pretty shallow utkatasana. I think they would stay pretty high. Like the chair they were in would be pretty high
More like a
because,
stool
yeah, wait, no, it would be
stool
high. Oh,
pose.
wait, isn't a stool low? I think of a low
Like
stool.
a
You mean like
kitchen,
a
like
bar stool?
a bar stool. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. So I think that's totally different, right? Bar stool versus stool, at least in my
Yeah,
mind.
like a footstool.
Hmm.
That would be a
So
very low chair pose.
right, totally. So for most yoga students, I think they would prefer like they were sitting into a bar stool rather than sitting into a chair. I think
So that's like if you're standing, that's the start, and then if
mhm,
you could imagine your thighs being parallel to the floor, you would say maybe
mhm.
halfway in between.
I think so. I think that's a really good summary. I think for most people to squat, to lower down in chair pose with their thighs literally like parallel to the floor, I think that would be a lot of work for many people. That would be like super fiery, and it could totally be done. But I think in general, we tend to see chair pose practiced a little higher than that. I'm
Hmm.
not really aware in the yoga world, and maybe it is out there, but I'm not aware of like one set depth that is just like
Okay.
this is the depth, and if you don't hit this, then you're not in
That's
chair pose.
fascinating because we'll talk about the comparison to strength training and the squat, but in
Mm-hmm.
the squat, there's like, oh, you have to squat
Oh, that's
to
so true.
thighs parallel to the floor, otherwise it's not a squat. But it
Oh my
sounds like in
gosh.
yoga, it's like, well, as long as you go down, I don't
Yeah,
know,
a certain degree, like
a
more
certain
than
amount, yeah, then
it's like
that's chair.
it's kind of like you know it when you see it, kind of. I feel like
Hmm.
that person's in chair pose, or
Would you
that
ever
person's.
like if you were ever teaching a class and somebody did like a
Mm.
1/8 step? But we would call that like an eighth squat or a quarter squat. Like
Mhm.
quarter squats will get poo pooed in a strength and conditioning context. It's like that's not a squat.
Oh,
You're not
that's just
going
like
low enough.
not deep
But would
enough.
you ever look around at your class and be like, "Hey, student, like that's not chair. You're not going low enough." I
That's a
mean,
great,
you
yeah.
probably wouldn't.
I think that definitely happens. For me, I don't think I've personally really done that, but I certainly have instructed, like, let's all go a little lower, just like from wherever you are right now, everyone descend
Oh,
lower. And
just to
sometimes
like
it'll, yeah, just so
add a little more
everybody,
spice.
exactly. So everybody, wherever they started, at least they all add a little more
That's a little
spice.
mean.
I know. Well, that's like sometimes that like level of quote evil that I
Yeah,
like to layer into my classes, and people like that because it's
yeah.
hard for them
That's
to do that on their own. They often want
I
someone
get
to
it.
encourage them. So yeah, so
However low you're going, now go lower
yeah, exactly. And again,
because lower is harder.
because lower is harder. Yeah, and I may not have made that clear when I was saying that most yoga students would prefer a shallower utkatasana. It's for that reason because the higher you are, the less work is involved. The lower you are, the more difficult it becomes.
Mhm.
Although I guess maybe we could point out it kind of depends because you could potentially consider that there's this spectrum from being all the way up standing and then all the way down to a full, what might be called like a deep squat, or in yoga, we call it malasana.
Or garland pose.
Yes, or
Although nobody
garland.
calls it that.
I know. That is totally like the other word for it, but I agree. Like, I have not had a teacher say, everyone, let's
Yeah.
come into garland pose. They say
Maybe
malasana.
because malasana is easy enough to remember.
I think you're right. And at least I personally like the way that it rolls off the tongue. And yeah.
Hmm.
In yoga, we tend to use that term, the malasana term, not so much squat, again, because it's yoga
Hmm.
versus strength and conditioning, but in a strength and conditioning world, that would be a deep squat.
Hmm.
So in the yoga world, utkatasana and malasana are two distinct poses, two distinct asanas, but you can kind of see how it's a continuum, like
Yeah,
a,
if you just keep going lower and lower into your chair, you
yeah.
eventually find yourself at the bottom in malasana.
Precisely. And of course, it does depend on the body. And many people have like mobility
Yeah,
restrictions
yeah.
at the
If you
bottom.
For some people, if they kept going lower and lower in the chair, their chair would fall over.
Yeah. That's such a good way to put
Because
it.
the setup for malasana might be a little bit different as far as the foot placement.
Mm-hmm, totally. And they just might lack some ankle mobility or things like that. So I was just bringing that up to point out that let's just assume someone's body who could pretty comfortably embody malasana. You know, like some people can sit all the way down into the bottom of a squat. And like I'm one of those people, so I can like attest to it. For me, if I come all the way down into malasana, I can actually just kind of come pretty comfortably rest there. And
Right.
I'm no
It's a
longer really
resting spot.
working. And I
Hmm.
know that's the case for many
Right.
yogis.
Yeah.
So
So that's
just
that's the interesting thing because we're talking about, okay, a shallow
mhm.
chair pose is easier than a deeper chair pose, but there's a sweet spot or a fire spot
Right,
parallel
right.
to the floor where it's hardest, and then once you
Yeah,
get below that, it becomes easier as you get more into what we would think of as malasana.
right. And especially once you're all the way down there, if you can just kind of hang
Hmm.
out, you could kind of just like not really be working in your legs at
Yeah,
all.
some people
Yes.
can.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Some people you mean can't actually work down there? Is that what you mean?
Some people can
Oh,
not
cannot
work
work.
down there
Yeah.
if your mobility is such that it is really challenging to assume
Yeah.
that deep pose, then it doesn't feel restful.
Exactly. And I know that's the case for many, many of our bodies for sure. Like that
Hmm.
full squat mobility is not available to many people. In the yoga world, I just point out because you know yoga tends to self-select for people who tend to be, and it shouldn't, and you know I don't like that about it, but it can tend to self-select for people who are a
Yeah,
little on the
people
bendier side.
people like to do things they're good at.
Precisely. So I think in the yoga population, we may have a higher percentage of people who are comfortable in malasana in a deep
Yeah,
squat.
that would be an interesting question for the audience.
Yes.
What percentage are you comfortable in a deep squat malasana, or are
Hmm.
you not? Just
I know. I wonder how that would compare to.
yeah, like maybe my audience versus yours. My
Hmm.
mine being a little bit more of a strength and conditioning fitness type of person, we tend
Totally.
not to be as comfortable in that deep position.
That's really interesting. But in the strength and conditioning world, sometimes is that deep squat trained? Like sometimes people will take and we're talking
Hmm.
like now like a loaded squat,
Oh
like
yeah.
you're holding weight. Sometimes
Hmm.
people do go through the full range, right, Travis? Like all the way down.
Yeah. So when I mentioned a full squat often being considered thighs parallel to the
Mm-hmm.
floor,
Mm-hmm.
that's the standard in the sport of powerlifting, which is just
Uh,
squatting, benching, and deadlifting.
just those
In the
three.
sport of Olympic lifting, which is a
Mm-hmm.
clean and jerk and a snatch, where you're taking the bar from the floor all the way up to the shoulders or and overhead or directly from the floor overhead, that's the clean and jerk and snatch respectively. In that strength sport, the deep squat is quintessential because that's the
Mm-hmm.
position that you catch or receive the bar in as you throw it off the floor. So
Right.
you have to get as low as you can so that you don't need to raise the bar as high when you're doing that explosive first pull. Or not first pull. There's
Oh,
a
that
bunch of
makes
pulls.
sense.
There are names, but anyway, yeah. So in that sport, the deep or the full expression of a squat would be all like rock bottom, and
Mm-hmm.
then you see other things like in CrossFit because they have these movement standards to determine whether you've achieved the rep successfully. They look for just hip crease below the knee, so it's
Uh,
it's below
oh,
parallel
got it. Got
if you
it.
were viewed from the side,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and yeah, and then there are still other personal trainers, strength and conditioning coaches who prefer, I think incorrectly, but like a 90-degree knee bend.
Oh, I'm aware of
So
some of
in that,
that.
yeah,
Like
a
that you
90
don't go
de-
any lower than 90.
yeah, and a 90-degree knee bend would not be as low as thighs parallel to the floor because when the
Right.
knees go forward, that makes that 90 degrees a slightly shallower squat.
Mm-hmm.
So probably the 90-degree knee bend would be not that far off of what you might characteristically think of as chair pose.
I think if as I'm picturing that in my mind, I think you're totally right. That's like at
Yeah,
least what I would picture.
it'd be like a good deep chair pose. I think not a 90-degree knee bend, but it would
Mm-hmm.
be thighs higher than parallel to the floor.
Right, right. That totally makes sense. Like angling up a little bit rather than being in that
Hmm.
total parallel.
Hmm.
So that's super interesting. And I think that we, just to take a little step back, because I don't think we explicitly said that, but we are kind of seeing this parallel between chair pose, utkatasana in the yoga world, and something like a squat in the strength and conditioning world. Like we're seeing an overlap between those two. And being that this is yoga meets movement science and I'm a yoga teacher, you're a strength and conditioning person, we like sometimes to draw those parallels and just to show
Hmm.
how looking at some movements that may be similar from the outside and looking at the ways that those movements are treated and practiced in different movement modalities and how that
Right. So
might help inform us.
yeah, big picture in strength and conditioning, we call the exercise a squat. It could be body weight or it could be performed with added load, a
Mm-hmm.
bar or a dumbbell or a kettlebell or a sandbag or anything on your back
Mm-hmm.
or held at your chest. And the the range of possible performances of a shallower range of motion squat, like a quarter squat to a half squat to a full squat, is the same, is analogous to the utkatasana down to
Uh-huh.
malasana.
That totally makes
Um,
sense.
and with, if you threw in having the arms overhead in your typical chair pose, that we
Yeah.
would call an overhead squat. And you could hold,
Right.
you could do it body weight, or you could have a bar over your head.
Mm-hmm.
It's,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So would you say that the more common form of a squat in the strength and conditioning world is not with the arms overhead? Like there's a variation where the arms
Yeah,
are,
you'd
but typically
call,
no, right?
if you just said squat, that's not going to be arms overhead.
Right.
If you'd want to describe it as an overhead squat to cue that that was going to
That's
be
what they're doing.
arms overhead. Yeah. So
Yeah,
that's a subtle difference where if you say utkatasana, that means arms overhead, because that's just
exactly.
the normal way
S
to do it.
Totally. So a main difference between the yoga and like the strength world squat is that in yoga it's body weight. We're always only using our own body weight, and in a strength world, generally, and like you mentioned, there can be body weight squats, but generally there's some level of added load, like holding a weight or something like that, to make it harder to actually build strength. Another difference that I just thought of as we were talking about this is that in the yoga world, chair pose is typically practiced isometrically. Like we
Yeah.
generally lower down and hold it, just
Right.
hold chair. I mean, sometimes if it's like in the context of sun salutation B, which that's a very common form of sun salutation, it's just one breath and then we move through.
Right.
But in other times, you go down to it into it and you actually hold. But
Yeah.
in
But
what? How is that different in the strength world?
it's in the strength world, it's a down and up, down and up, down and up. So
Mm-hmm.
you're saying you either go down and go up and keep going, or you go down and stay down. And that would
Right.
be somewhat atypical. Well, no, it would be atypical. It's certainly an option in the strength world, like doing chair pose, basically doing body
Mm-hmm.
weight isometric holds in a squat, or a wall sit might be
Mm-hmm.
the way that might be more
Right.
commonly
That's a really
practiced.
good point. Yeah. So that's like
Um,
chair pose, but you're at the wall, right? Like
yep,
your
yep, yep, yep.
torso is on the wall.
Hmm.
Those are tough. We've prescribed those in our strength for yoga program.
Hmm.
I like
Yeah,
those.
they're fun. I mean, in
Hmm.
like a type two kind of fun way.
Right, right. And because they just a wall and then whatever weight you're using, they're pretty accessible. So like if people are doing their strength practice, say at home, I mean they could do it in the gym, but if they just want to do it at home, it's not that hard to just implement that at home, like a wall squat, maybe with some
Hmm.
added weight, maybe not added weight. I mean there are variations, but yeah, so there are some overlaps there. Like in some cases in the strength world, squat may be treated isometrically,
Yeah,
but
but in a yoga practice,
it's
you're
not
very rarely three sets of 10 chair pose, down, up, down, up, down, up.
precisely. You
Yeah.
may see it, in and out a little bit, like as a flow. I've even taught that before, but
Whereas
it's not.
maybe as like a pulse between,
Hmm.
okay, do your chair
Hmm.
pose, now go down a little bit more, come back up, stay down a
Yes,
little more.
kind of like how I was saying that I've instructed sometimes to get people a little lower. Yeah, so maybe it's a little dynamic, but in general, I'd say, I mean, most yoga standing poses are isometrics. Generally, if we're
Hmm.
talking like the most common way you see them, Warrior Two, it's like you strike Warrior Two, and you
The
hold
one
that.
the one place I could see it maybe is like goddess pose or horse stance, kind of
Hmm.
doing more of those pulses.
Yeah, I see that sometimes.
Yeah.
Yes, but
Still
also
not
probably
like a
more.
proper down and up all the way squat.
Right, exactly. And so in the strength and conditioning world, the reason that squats are generally done in like a dynamic way, or we might call it like in a strength context, we call that for reps, like you do a certain set for reps. What's the reason that squats would be done that way for reps?
Just from the idea of strengthening through a full range of motion.
Right. That makes sense. And that's also a really good point about in a context in which we just go to one joint angle and hold that maybe for a bit and then move on. That's not necessarily, well, first of all, it's questionable how actually strengthening that is in a body weight context, like I'm thinking
Right.
yoga, but it's also really only one joint angle. It's not necessarily working through the full, like all the way down and all the way up, or whatever you're wanting to that to be, like considering a full range there. So
Hmm.
that's an interesting distinction, which actually I guess leads me to ask, like, if we're thinking anatomically and biomechanically, like what's the point of chair pose and utkatasana, like in a yoga context, and what's the point of a
Yeah.
squat in the strength context?
Well, I think generally speaking, we're talking about strengthening the lower body, but I use that term loosely, the word strengthening in the yoga sense, because if you're just doing body weight and you're not necessarily holding it to fit, well, no, whether you are holding it to failure or not, because the load is relatively light, that unless it's so hard to do chair pose that you can only hold it for a few seconds, you're really
Hmm.
working more in an endurance capacity, holding it for 20, 30 seconds.
That's right. Because
So if you think of endurance as strengthening, if you use the term very loosely, then sure, you could say, oh, we're strengthening the lower body, but it's really working on the, either you could say muscular endurance or strength endurance.
That's right. And there's a difference between actual like maximal muscle strength, which is like generally I think what you and I mean when we talk about strength training versus muscular endurance strength. They are like two different types of strength.
Mm-hmm.
But for that maximal
Yeah.
strength,
So in a strength and conditioning context, if you were to use a lightweight and do sets of 15 or 20 more, now we're talking about muscular endurance. But if you're using a weight that you can only do 6, 8, 10, maybe
mhm,
12 reps, that the fewer reps that you can do because the weight is so heavy that it only allows you to do that many reps, that's where it's actually more about developing strength or absolute strength or maximal strength.
that's right. That's right. So in a strength and conditioning context, it's very possible to continue to add load so that something like a squat can continue to be building
Right.
strength.
Now, and if you want to do that in yoga because you've adapted to your chair pose, you can either go lower, which sure, it gets harder, and then you are signaling or creating new adaptation as you get lower. But at a certain point, the only way that you can make it harder is by holding it longer, and you're no longer actually building strength. You're just building endurance, which is fine, but you should be aware of what's going on. And if your goal
Exactly.
is to build strength for the many benefits that strength has to offer, then you have to do something different besides just holding it for longer.
That's right. That's right. Something different than just like a body weight pose over and over and over with there's like no progression built in there in terms of like adding more
Mm-hmm.
load to the body. So it's really hard to truly, I mean, you can build strength up to a point in like a body weight yoga practice and practicing utkatasana, but once your body is adapted to that, and that doesn't really take that long for your body to adapt, then the more you keep doing utkatasana over and over as you keep doing yoga for months and then years, you're not actually building more strength. When we're talking about like maximal strength, that's not happening. You probably just plateau, and it's fine. That's totally fine. But if we just want to be clear in our goals and our intentions, if actual
Mm-hmm.
strength is something that we're after, we should know that practicing chair pose over and over in a body weight context is not really going to do that for us,
Right.
which
One
again
way,
is
maybe, if you had your heart set on doing this strengthening in the body weight or in on the mat, would be to shift to a one-legged chair,
totally. And
which is
yeah.
imperfect because now you've introduced a balance challenge,
Hmm.
and it's harder to produce force when you are also simultaneously trying to balance on one leg.
That's right. So it's a little limited, but it definitely will if you come into chair pose and you lift one foot off the floor, then you're
Hmm.
definitely adding more load to the standing leg and it has to
Doubling it
work harder.
almost, or
Yeah,
maybe
right.
exactly doubling it.
Right. So that is definitely a way. And again, it's limited because it's just up to a point. Like once you adapt that, then what else is there? But that is a way to progress chair pose for sure.
Hmm.
And we
Would you say that any of the other chair pose variations are progressions or just variations?
good
Because we have
question.
twisting chair,
And
pigeon
I include pigeon chair
chair,
in there, yeah, which is like chair
which I
pose
guess
with
is a
one leg
one-legged
and pigeon.
similar. Yeah.
Hmm. In my mind, I think those are more variations, and not. I mean,
Hmm.
it's harder in certain way. Like pigeon chair has the balance element, so it's harder for balance compared to 2 feet on the floor, but not necessarily for strength. So maybe it's a progression if you're thinking balance, but if
Well,
we're talking
wait.
about strength,
Pigeon chair is a single leg chair, right?
yes, it
So that
is.
that would be more challenging from a balance standpoint, right?
Sorry, you're
Or
totally right.
sorry, more challenging from a strength standpoint.
Right. It would be in my I'm sorry, I was not being clear. It's not that much different in my mind to just a single leg squat. So not a
Probably
progression
actually
beyond that.
easier than from a strength standpoint. Probably easier than a single leg squat because that other leg is at least has a point of contact with the
With
thigh to
something.
do something. Yeah.
That's a really
Whereas
good point.
a regular single leg, you're just picking that foot up and then there's nothing
Totally.
to
Totally.
push on.
So yeah, pigeon chair is a progression compared to regular chair. Um, but but yeah, but again, it's all just kind of and then there's twisting chair as you mentioned, where maybe you bring your hands in front of your heart, twist, and maybe hook your elbow over the opposite knee. So then you're in a twisting form of utkatasana. That's a very
That
common
actually
one.
would load the side that you're twisting to a little bit more.
Yeah, you mean as far as the leg, like the lower body?
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, and a variation I often teach, because if it is pretty effortful, is to
Ooh,
come
I
into
think I know.
twisting chair. Do you know? What do you
I think I know.
what is it?
You come into twisting chair and then while maintaining that chair, you step the one leg
Mhm.
back
That's
into
exactly right.
twisting high
Line.
lunge.
Mhm. That's what I would call that, yeah. Yeah,
Or
exactly.
the Jenni
I
Rawlings
love that you
special.
knew that. Well,
I
I
could
didn't
see
invent
it
it
in
or
your eye.
anything. I just happen to really like that transition. It helps you
Yeah.
feel good work through the lower body. But yeah, and it's like a slow thing. It's like you come into twisting chair and then you lift the other foot and you kind of hover there and then you ideally slowly take it back so you're having to control all of that.
And then you
And
reverse.
then you can revert. Yeah, so you could move on to something else or you could reverse. So you could just pick up the foot from the
Hmm.
lunge and try to slowly step it forward and land lightly back in the twisting chair. It's a good one. So
It's
definitely a
evil.
way. What did you say? Did you say
It's
evil?
evil. Yeah.
Yeah, it totally is. Which is maybe one reason why I've sequenced it into some of my classes. But yeah, yes. So these are some examples of the way that you of how you can take chair pose and yeah, offer variations, offer some progressions again to a point. Um yeah, so that's so yeah, so chair pose doesn't always exist always in one way. And then another thing I was hoping we could clarify about chair pose and just about squats in general is so when you do something like chair pose, like I mentioned kind of back in the beginning, we could have we have like a general certain amount of movement through like the hips and the knees, hip flexion and knee flexion as we lower down. But depending on our emphasis in the moment, and maybe depending on the individual body and their anthropomorphic dimensions, those actual degrees of movement at those two places may differ. But we
Hmm.
may layer on some intention. Like we might ask someone to squat down by bringing their knees more forward. Like they could squat down in a more like knee dominant way, that might be called, or they could squat that's in a more hip dominant way where they bring the hips like back. There's still going to be movement at both the hips and the knees, but we are just emphasizing more hips or more knees.
Hmm.
So, could you speak to like the difference between those two and maybe how they relate to like a squat versus a hip hinge at one end of the spectrum and how they're different?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. So we've been saying, okay, chair pose is a squat, chair pose is a squat. But
Mm-hmm.
as you mentioned, there are like if you, it's a continuum, but on either end of the spectrum, you can do it as more of a knees forward, torso vertical. We would call that in a strength and conditioning context, a knee dominant,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, a knee dominant lower body movement. or you could keep your knees tracking. You could disallow your knees to go forward, so
Mm-hmm.
your shins stay more vertical, and
Mm-hmm.
then to descend into your chair pose, that means that the movement is coming through a posterior shift of the hips, and then
Mm-hmm.
the torso is coming forward. So more, or almost not all, more of the movement is coming from hip flexion, as opposed to kind of equal parts hip and knee flexion, as I mentioned, if you were allowing the knees to go forward. So
Mm-hmm.
when the knees go, okay, and so when you do it with that vertical shin, hips back, torso forward, we call that, in a strength and conditioning context, we call that a hip dominant exercise. And
Mm-hmm.
that will load the hip extension muscles more, so hamstrings, glutes, and erector spinae, versus the knee dominant version where the knees go forward, which is more of a quadriceps, knee extension
Mm-hmm.
dominant quadriceps movement. So in a strength and conditioning setting, you could take a squat actually, and you could do it as more of a knee dominant squat or as more of a hip dominant squat, or you could, depending on where you're holding the weight is kind of how
Mm-hmm.
it
Right.
differentiates the
That's
name
going to
of
be
the
a different.
exercise.
Right.
But the hip dominant style of lifting, we could also call a deadlift if the
Mm-hmm.
weight, if you were picking the weight up from the floor and it's your arms are straight at your sides. So
Right.
you can basically you can do a chair pose either in a hip dominant or a knee dominant way. Those would
Mm-hmm.
be the two extremes, and then maybe somewhere in the middle is where it would be most commonly practiced. But
Right.
if you could choose for yourself. Today I'm interested in working the fronts of my thighs. I'm going to try
Mm-hmm.
to stay really vertical and let my knees go forward. That's also going to give me a little bit more of a stretch through the back of my calves, so
There's
I'm going
that
to get a
too.
little bit more ankle mobility at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could say, today I want to give my quads a break. I'm
Mm-hmm.
interested in working more of the posterior chain muscles, hamstrings, glutes, low back. I'm going to do my chair pose in more of a hip dominant fashion, not going to allow my knees to come forward. I'm just going to get the movement through my, majority through my hips
That's
by
right.
sending my hips back.
And necessarily, if you're going to do it that way, then the torso tends to hinge forward more
Right.
versus like that
Yeah.
vertical torso. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you could kind of think of like there's like a spectrum there, like with two extremes. And
Right.
one, you have a total upright torso and just the knees go forward. And then the other
Yeah.
is just the hips go back and the torso goes forward.
And I would say, as a naive yoga student for a long time, I didn't know what the correct way to do it
Mm-hmm.
was. My case is a little bit unique, or maybe a lot of it unique, because I don't have any dorsiflexion through my
Mm-hmm.
prosthetic side ankle, so that side
That's right. So
can't.
you
The
can't.
only way that I can, the only way that I can do a really knee dominant chair pose is
Right.
to allow my heel to pop off the floor, basically as
Right.
soon as my knee goes forward. So I probably tend towards the more hip dominant
Mm-hmm.
style, because it's just easier for me to keep. Because I think one of the, not that there are any rules, but we we didn't describe the heels popping off the ground any
Right.
point up into this conversation as being characteristic of a chair pose, right? So
That's a good
generally
point.
speaking, you do keep the feet flat on the ground. So for me to keep my feet flat on the ground, I necessarily have to have a more vertical shin and do it in more of a hip dominant fashion. But I also would be fighting myself if the teacher were trying to teach it as more like chest up, like
Mm-hmm.
don't allow your torso to come
That's right.
forward. And it's like, well, how can I can't get my body to do what you're asking me to do. So that was always, I never liked the chair pose for that reason. Because it never, like, if the teacher instructed it that way, it didn't feel right to me, because I was trying to do two
Right.
competing things at
That
once.
does not work for
But
your body.
then, right. But then I learned that chair pose could look however you want it to look within reason, in terms of this continuum of more of a hip or knee strategy
Mhm.
and more of an
Mhm.
upright or inclined torso. And that works really well for me, the
That's
more hip
great.
dominant one.
That gave you the permission to then just like fit the pose to your body rather than feeling like you weren't doing it
Hmm.
right or you had to fit your
Hmm.
body to the pose when you literally couldn't fit your body to the pose.
Right. I'd love to hear your evolution of how you taught this over the years, because I think you maybe started
Yes.
one way, went to the other potential extreme, and maybe now have come somewhere to the middle. Would that be an accurate?
I think the first part of that, yes, definitely back in my earlier days of after I took like certain trainings that taught me, about the importance of alignment to protect the body and aligning our bodies well to keep our bodies pain free, things like that. There was a lot of emphasis, at least in the trainings that I did, on well, really two things. And this is going to actually, I think, get right into our list that we were going to start talking about of a lot of these alignment questions and confusion that comes up around chair pose. So I think this kind of leads us right into that. But in this training, there was this big emphasis on the importance of glute strengthening. So the glutes, the backside of the hips. There was this idea that everybody in like Western society has weak, underdeveloped glutes, and that that's causing our bodies all these problems and all these imbalances. And
We have an episode about that.
I was gonna say that we totally do. Do you remember what it's called?
No.
Are the
Do you?
Yeah, I do. I do. Are the glutes a magic muscle? Is an episode. It's just I don't know, 5 episodes ago or something like that. And we can link it in the show notes. But we totally talk about that, like that tendency in general for the glutes to be elevated as this like super important area of the body to target. But I'm just bringing that up today because it ties into chair pose. So this few trainings that I took definitely emphasized that. And that was one of the reasons. There were two reasons, but that was one of the reasons why chair pose was always taught in the context of this training and these beliefs about the body. It was taught that it was really important for the body and that it was correct to only do a chair pose that was more on that, I'd say, the hip hinge side. So meaning like if you were going to cue chair pose, you would cue people to send their hips back and to not let the knees travel forward. Because as you described, Travis, when you practice that version of squatting where it's more hip dominant, then you're targeting more of those hip extensor muscles, which includes the glutes. And so that would be the way that it was cued. And it was twofold. It was one that we really wanted to target those glutes because they were causing us all these problems, these evil, weak glutes. And then the other side was that if we allowed our knees to track forward, that was bad for the knees. And that
They
was
would
going to
explode.
exactly. That
Just like
was,
poof,
they would just
or
like, dis-
boom.
right. As soon as you let your knees go forward, for sure. So that was also tied into it, was just that like letting the knees track forward, like, when you're up in a standing pose like that, a standing position, that's bad for the knees and you're going to cause wear and tear on the knees, pain and injury. So we had to avoid that. It was like red X on
Mm.
knees forward, toward the toes or like don't even talk about past the toes. That's like even
Ah,
crazy. And it was all about it had to be hips back. So that really informed me when I would teach utkatasana. And I have to admit, Travis, that I have this memory of you when you started taking classes in my online class library. I don't know why you did this,
I started
but
from the
you
beginning.
you scroll. It's like 200 classes in there. You scrolled all the way down to the bottom. They're in date
I wanted to
order.
be thorough.
You want to take like every single one from the earliest to the
Hmm.
most recent. They're in date order. So you scrolled all the way to the bottom to the very
Heck
first
yeah, I
class,
did.
which was like years
20,
ago.
2014 or
It
so.
was something like that. And you took that class and maybe even a few, like there's like a handful
Darn
that I
right. They
did
were
all
great.
those. And that's what you told me. You said you thought they were great.
You don't
And,
believe it, but they were great.
but you also,
I
and
just had
you,
to, I think I said I had to, like, what, ignore or take some of the narrative around the instructions
Mhm.
with a grain of salt. But I particularly remember doing chair pose and you instructing it that way. I'm like, ooh, this is great for me.
Oh, for you, you're so right.
Right.
For you, if that class was made for you, it would be like perfect for you. But the way I was
Hmm.
teaching it, which was more like everyone should do it this way and this is the right way,
Yeah,
is
there were
not.
some subtle undertones, or maybe not so subtle undertones,
I
of
know.
the don't let your knees go forward.
I
This is
know.
the correct way.
I remember when you told me that, like
You were
I
like, oh, I gotta take that class down.
yes, and I remember like my face got red, like I was embarrassed. I was like, I can't believe because normally I try to, if I had a class with things like that, I would take it off the website, and I just hadn't remembered that in those classes
If you turned if you turned the sound off and did the flow, it's a terrific class. It's just that there's
right.
some explanations that you wouldn't agree with anymore.
That's
But that's
precisely
okay.
true. But the actual movements are great. It's just what's the
Yeah, well,
narrative
I think
there?
there were even some things I was like, oh, you should bring that back.
Yeah,
Forget what it was.
yes.
Maybe it
Uh,
was like some finger stretching.
oh yeah, you have such a good memory, and I think it was it was like stretch the
Mhm.
finger while pushing the other knuckle up. I think this is what you're talking about, and
Yeah.
it's this great finger stretch that I forgot about because it was so long ago. See
Mhm.
if we can put that in a class coming up. But
I'm sure
yeah.
that every teacher, if they rewatched if they,
Mhm.
most teachers probably don't have recordings of themselves from 2014, but
That's so
if they did,
true.
I'm sure there would be
That's
some
so
things that
true.
they would disagree with. And if there weren't things that they disagreed with, that would probably be indicative that they hadn't
Absolutely.
evolved as much as maybe one would hope in the intervening 8 years.
I really love how you point that out. And it's so true, right? Yeah. It's almost like if we haven't changed anything in 8 years, it's like, have we just stayed really stuck and we're not
Yeah.
taking in new
Yeah.
information?
And we've talked about this with your blog. Like you'll go through and
Hmm.
add some disclaimers.
Hmm.
Harder to do that with a yoga class.
Yes. That's totally true. Like, I don't know, put me like as a talking head over, like, just so you know, like, no, that would not work.
Right.
But anyway, so clearly I don't teach chair pose with emphases like that today, but back then I did. And like I mentioned, it was for two reasons. It was one, that it was super important that everybody strengthen the glutes, and two, it was that knees forward was bad for us. So before we
And
record, yeah.
should we just say now you're probably somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, like, but I never like it's not. I wouldn't say I went to another extreme where I started teaching
No,
chair pose like
no,
always knees forward or something.
no.
But just like I just don't try to control it. In a yoga body weight context, it'd be different
Hmm.
in a strength training context where we have different goals and maybe like
You're deliberately trying to elicit a certain
hmm
adaptation.
there are different variations of squats in the strength and conditioning world. And you would intentionally may ask someone to do one because you have a specific intention for exactly what type of strength you're trying to elicit.
Yeah, I think like everybody has a movement signature where like this is going to be their more comfortable way of performing the squat. Ideally, I guess from a mobility standpoint, you would want people to have the ability to perform either a more upright or
Hmm.
more torso inclined version of either like well basically of the squat, um, just for the sake of being more versatile. But
Hmm.
yeah, you'll necessarily gravitate towards the one that you're more comfortable with, the one that you feel stronger in.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So, can we talk about the knees over toes thing a little bit more,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
idea that that is like a dangerous thing to be doing, and we should avoid letting the knees track forward?
Because they'll
Bef-
explode.
exactly. Before we recorded this episode, we put out like a call for questions, just about chair pose and about things you've heard about it that are confusing. And the number one thing that people responded with was not letting the knees move forward. Like just that they hear that all the time. They weren't clear on what would happen, if you do let the knees go forward. Why do people say that? So just a lot of questions surrounding this. What do
Hmm.
you think about letting the knees track forward of the toes in chair pose or a squat?
Yeah, I think it's okay.
You do,
I think it's okay. I
Travis?
think it might even be desirable. So in a squat, and there's these same questions pop up in the squat in the strength and conditioning fitness context where somebody at some point said, "Don't let the knees go past the toes," and then it showed up in the textbooks. Blah blah
Oh
blah.
yeah.
It created like this whole thing of you shouldn't let your knees go forward. And then when you drill down, it's like, but wait a second. If the ideal version of this upright knee dominant squat, like that you would do if you were an Olympic lifter, requires the knees to go
Mm-hmm.
forward in
Mm-hmm.
order to keep a vertical torso,
Mm-hmm.
then these two rules are incongruous. Like you cannot keep an upright torso and if your knees aren't going forward past your
Right.
toes.
Like one requires the
So
other.
yeah. So there's been some research looking at the forces through the knee and through
Mm-hmm.
the hips and low back in these various different techniques or different styles of the squat.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it is true that if you allow your knees to go forward past your toes, there is more force that goes through your knees.
That's true.
So
That's
if
correct.
you, that is true. So if you look at that in isolation, you say, well, I want to protect my knees. I'm not going to let my knees go past my toes.
Mm-hmm.
When you do that and you don't let your knees go past your toes and you have more of a hip dominant squat, that just shifts those forces to your hips and low
They,
back.
they have to go somewhere, right? So if they don't go
Yeah,
through the
the
knees,
weight's
they're going
on
to go
your
somewhere
back either
else.
way, right? So, which is also potentially fine,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but it's like it's narrow-minded to say, well, I want to protect my knees, so I'm gonna keep my knees back. Like you
Mm-hmm.
said, the forces have to go somewhere. So then the question is really, well, what's safe? Like, is
Right.
the amount of load that's going through the knees, if you allow the knees to go forward, safe? And the answer is yes.
Right. It's
You
not beyond.
obviously, it's not going to explode your knees.
They're
It doesn't.
capable of handling that load.
Right. Now you want to be smart and you want
Mm-hmm.
to, if you want to build that up over time, but the point is that the knees are capable of handling that load, especially in a body weight
That's
context,
what I was just gonna
but
mention. Yeah.
including within a loaded context. The one thing that maybe you would want to be cautious of is just going to end range,
Mm-hmm.
uh, knees forward, which is just that, like, you don't go that far in a squat usually. I mean,
Like
unless you're an
really
Olympic
trying to.
lifter rock bottoming out to catch the weight.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a sport, and they're
Mm-hmm.
adapting to that. But like for most people, if the knees go 2 inches, 4 inches past the
The
toes,
toes.
that would be a lot, and that would still be perfectly fine.
Right. Right.
Not
Um,
too much.
and definitely something that if you load it and increase loads over time, the tissues in the knee should adapt to continue to handle that load. Let alone in a yoga context where we literally have no weights and it's just our body weight. Like doing chair pose where the knees track forward, or Travis, or even doing, because these same rules they're also applied to a lot of our standing poses in yoga, like warrior one pose, for
Right.
example, or high lunge, or low lunge,
Mhm.
where the back knee's on the ground, meaning the front leg isn't even bearing very much weight. But
Yeah. I
still,
always imagined
still,
that was an aesthetic, but no, I guess they say the same thing. It's both,
right.
right?
There's both. Yeah.
Yeah.
You mean aesthetic in that just the 90-degree angle at the knee is like the pose. And so we're trying to do that. And that's one reason why.
Yeah, the 90 degree with the vertical shin.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
But
But I guess
then
that's the same in chair pose maybe. Like, oh, we like that vertical
we just
shin.
like how it looks.
Yeah. But I feel like the argument is more for like, don't let the knees go past the
No,
toes.
for sure
Yeah.
yeah, I hear a lot of warnings about that. Like that it's
Yeah.
supposed to be bad for yeah. So it's not for the
Mhm.
aesthetic reason. It's just like, don't do that. You're going to hurt your knee. So that would be if
Mhm.
someone were in Warrior One. And now we're talking, that's not 2 feet side by side, but it's like a lunge, 1 foot forward, one back behind you. And the idea is if they do Warrior One and that knee tracks forward over those toes rather than being stacked right above the ankle, that would be incorrect in like these yoga contexts, and that would be said as a misalignment. That's another term for it, and
Mhm.
something that's going to injure the knee. And all of that is not supported, I would suggest, by like what we know, what
Nah.
research literally has shown.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
nonsense.
Right, right. So, and
Someone said it once and then it
it
just got
spread
whispered down the lane.
and everyone started to believe it. It's so true. Plus, Travis, don't our knees track forward of our toes in many just like activities of daily living, for example,
Yeah,
or at least in that
going
direction?
the common example that everybody gives is, well, when you go down the stairs, your knees go
Mm-hmm.
past the toes. I think that's a little different.
You do?
I, it's a good simple visual for like, oh, I can see
Getting the
that the
point
knees go
across.
past. Yeah, but also like it's not exactly the same. I mean, you're going
Right.
downstairs, like your heel's not on the ground anymore, and your weight is
Oh, that's
being
true.
distributed forward. If you were doing like a step down exercise where you were
Uh-huh.
keeping your heel down and you were tapping your heel on the floor in front of you, like
Mm-hmm.
if imagine you're standing on the last step and then you
Yeah.
were like going down and then going back up,
Mm-hmm.
that would be like a true, oh look, your knees going past your toes, and that's basically a single leg squat.
Oh, totally.
um but it's fine to get the point across that like,
Right.
look, your knees go past your toes in everyday real life, but it's not exactly
It's not the same as
apples to
like a
apples.
squat.
Yeah,
That makes sense. That totally makes. I'm glad you pointed that out. I hadn't thought about it that way before. But
it's
it's just
it's
to
fine. It's a quick example to like show people like, hey look, your knees are going past your toes here and you don't worry about that.
right. Why are we worried about it, especially in a body weight context? But then it
Hmm.
seems that even in the strength context where there's a lot more load involved, it's still not something that, of course, it's all like you said about being smart and loading progress. Don't just dive into huge loads on you and then doing that movement, but do it over
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
And then I think just as far as the knees over toes thing goes, like one final point, and we can move on from talking about this, is that there may be some reasons some people may want to avoid moving in that direction. If, for
Totally.
example, they have anterior knee pain, and if letting the knees track forward reproduces that pain or creates that symptom, then maybe, and again, this is all a big maybe because, as we've talked about before on the podcast, pain with exercise is kind of not necessarily always bad, but just assuming someone doesn't want to feel that pain, they may choose to back off. And maybe if they were doing squats or chair pose, they may intentionally choose a variation where the knees don't track forward so that they can
Yeah.
avoid sensitizing the knee. Ideally, it's just a temporary solution until that
Right.
sensitivity
I
calms
think
down.
that's a good thing to bear in mind. It's not like oh, you're a person who has knee pain. You're a knee pain person, therefore you should only ever do your chair pose with vertical shin in a hip dominant fashion. It's like, no, you
Right.
in this moment for now,
Mm-hmm.
try it that way. If it doesn't hurt, great. And we can revisit. It doesn't have to be a for the rest of your life. This is how you have to do it. It's just a
Right.
temporary modification, and then you can revisit, uh, or you can progressively shift more towards the knee dominant fashion as
Right.
your knee calms down.
Yeah, exactly. So that might be, just to like throw a bone toward the no knees over toes. That's like
Hmm.
one instance in a
Yeah,
particular individual where they may
yeah.
choose to avoid it.
Healthy knees, no problem. If
That's
you
right.
have a pre-existing knee thing,
Yeah,
then this would be a perfectly sensible thing to avoid in the short term and modify. But it doesn't mean that it's perfect. It's like it's actually pretty wonderful. Like we can still do chair pose. We'll just do it this other way. That's perfectly okay too.
right. Exactly. That is, yeah.
As opposed to like, oh, you have knee pain, so you should avoid chair pose. Chair pose is bad.
100%. Instead, we can have more options and then we can like in an inclusive way all do the same pose in that container, something like that.
Hmm.
I like that. So I think that kind of outlines what we would like to present about knees forward over toes. Uh, Another very common and maybe even was asked almost as much, if not as much, as knees over toes when we threw this out for questions about alignment in chair pose. But the other biggie is about whether or not we should tuck or untuck our tailbone in chair pose. Yoga teachers tend to make a really big deal out of this. Like it's really important that when you come into chair, it's either that you should lift the tailbone, so that would be like an anterior tilt of the pelvis relative to the spine, and that may create some more lumbar lordosis or like that curve in the low back.
Hmm.
So sometimes the cue is given to lift the tailbone, and other times the opposite cue is given to tuck the tailbone. So to do the opposite, so tailbone down, posteriorly tilt the pelvis, and then that may take some of the curve out of the low back. And in both cases, in my experience at least, when I hear teachers give the instruction on either side, it's always with the same purpose, which is like to protect the back. or protect the spine, even
How
though it's
can this
two
be?
opposing. I don't know. How do
I
you
feel
could
like the I feel like the obvious answer is okay. Well, it has to be somewhere in the middle because
right,
people are
right.
arguing on either extreme.
Exactly. That both of those actions will result in the same thing, which is like to
Hmm.
injure the back or something. So
Yeah.
for I guess my one question for you, Travis, being like an injury prevention expert and understanding the research on all of this in yoga specifically. So let's not think about the strength world where people are like loaded up in a squat, but in a yoga context with chair pose,
Doesn't
do
matter.
you think it you like know what my question is? Yeah. Doesn't matter if you're in there, if you lift your tailbone, and we're talking like how many degrees of movement is that, either
Not a
direction.
lot. Yeah.
If you lift it or if you tuck it, yeah, you would suggest it doesn't matter as far as injury and pain go.
I don't think you have to worry about it at all. I think you can just do you. Whatever happens, happens. But if one feels better than the other, then great.
Right.
If you've been told to tuck and that hurts, or you've been told to
Mm-hmm.
what's the other
Untuck.
untuck?
Lift your tailbone.
Yeah, lift, and that bothers you, then just like do what feels right,
That's right. That's right. Like
or
listen to
or
your
don't
body.
don't worry about it at all.
Totally. Now, would you suggest that if we go back a couple episodes when we had our episode on micromanaging and the title of it was Stop
Oh gosh,
Micromanaging Your Yoga
yeah.
Students, do you think this is an example of that?
This is a
Like,
this is a perfect example. Yeah,
you think cueing position of the tailbone in chair pose at all? Unless there's like a really specific reason in a specific moment, but just when you're generally teaching the pose in general, cueing what people should do with their tailbone, would you call that micromanaging?
yeah, I would.
I'm so
I and
glad.
I in a strength and conditioning context, you could also maybe make the case that it's not a big deal.
Uh
And
huh.
for a long time, people were making the case that it was a big deal. So in when the tailbone tucks in a strength and conditioning setting, we call that butt wink.
Yes, butt wink. Like
It's
it's
a
winking or something?
posterior tilt of the pelvis leading to lumbar flexion,
Mhm.
and that has been vilified in a squatting context, especially in a deeper squat, because the fear is that you're putting a lot of load through the low back in this
Mhm.
lumbar flex position. So the counteraction to that was everybody should arch their back. Arch, arch, arch. And
Right.
so I've never heard anybody cue tuck your tailbone, because that's
Oh, right.
usually being what we're trying to prevent in this like two depth squat where you're roughly parallel to the floor, thighs.
Right.
So anyway, that that was the cue for a while. Everybody should arch. We're trying to maintain lumbar lordosis, but as it turns out, that's sort of impossible to do
Mhm. Right.
pretty
We know this from
uniformly.
research, right? Like you
Yeah,
can't.
pretty
Yeah.
uniformly as people squat, they will experience some tucking of the tail,
And
some butt
lumbar
wink,
flexion.
even and lumbar flexion. Even when it looks visually like that's not happening, it
That's
still
right.
is
It just
happening.
is. Yeah. Because you can't
So
necessarily see the movement in between all the vertebrae, like your eyes from the
yeah,
outside. Like you
yeah.
would need some sort of
Sometimes it's more
imaging.
obvious
Mhm.
that like extreme to the naked eye, but it's happening all the time, and so it's probably not something that we have to worry about. And on top of that, it's also probably you probably also don't want to excessively arch either.
Right.
So because
Excessively
then you're
arch.
just like you're creating not artificial stability, but you're getting stability from the approximation of your vertebrae, as opposed to being in a more
Um,
neutral range and
mhm.
creating the stability through muscular engagement. So all of that also lends itself to probably don't have to worry about it too much, unless something really outlandish is happening.
Right, unless it's, like, extreme or if someone has,
Yeah,
like, some pain or something going on where they
yeah.
might wanna
So
modify.
yeah, so I my tendency now is like I'm looking for neutral. Neutral is a range.
Right.
You can do some pelvic tilts in standing or on the floor, cat cow, whatever. Find neutral, and then like start there. And yes, you will probably tuck as you go, and
Mhm.
that's also probably okay. and we're talking about in a loaded context. So
In
in
a
an
strength.
unloaded bodyweight context where you're probably not even going as low as you might be in a strength and conditioning context, it
Yeah.
really isn't a big deal either
Right.
way.
Right. Thank you so much for saying that, especially just coming from your background knowledge and expertise. I think I mean we could do a whole episode on just the tailbone and all the cues in the yoga world that like
Hmm.
the tailbone and its position is just so micromanaged and thought to
Hmm.
be super important. And so I just
Yeah.
think it's good to make this point that
Yeah. I guess if I had to pick one or the other, I would say neutral, as in don't worry about it. Um,
right.
so that you're not taking it to either extreme, but also know that as you go down, it will naturally tend to tuck, but you don't have to either exaggerate that or try to counteract it.
Right. It's just kind of the natural movement of like your bones relative to one another as you lower and as you lift.
Lumbo-pelvic rhythm, is that a
I
thing?
think that, yeah, I've heard that before. Yes, lumbopelvic rhythm.
Yeah.
Totally. That's like a sophisticated term. But yeah, it's like how the body naturally moves and we don't need to like nitpick or override the way that it's naturally going to move. We don't need to worry about
Hmm.
it. Um thank you for going through that so perfectly.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then I find when talking about chair pose, those were the first two biggies. I'm glad we covered knees forward,
Yeah.
and then the tuck or untuck. But a third one that tends to come up in my experience is about foot positioning
Yeah.
and whether the feet should be together, whether they should be hip distance, or whether they should be wider. Like there's kind of three general options there. And
Hmm.
there tend to be a lot of questions about that too. Like what's the right foot width in chair pose? Now, in the strength world with a squat, which, we're suggesting there's overlap, but we're also acknowledging they're not exactly the same. But in a
Hmm.
squat context, what's up with like the foot width?
Yeah. People love to argue about this too. The textbook setup would be feet are shoulder width apart and toes are flared to 30 degrees.
Oh yeah, so toes in out. Let's talk. We can include that in talking about this
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah,
that's kind of on our
yeah,
list too.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
So you said feet are hip distance and toes are out to 30 degrees in
yeah.
a
Now there
strength.
are other people who would say that the toes should be forward, and
Yeah.
they're wrong. No, I'm kidding. That's fine, but most people will have they'll be more comfortable having their toes flared.
Hmm.
So I guess spoiler, like shoulder distance is a good place to start.
Hmm.
Toes could be forward, but toes flaring will probably be a little bit more comfortable. And then the width being shoulder distance, some people that'll be good. Some
Right.
people will need to be a little wider. Some people will need to be a little more narrow. And then
Because, yeah, sorry. I
the
was just trying to think
real
shoulder distance
shoulders are
versus hip.
wider than
Yeah, that's what
hips.
I was. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you did shoulder
Um,
distance, they'd be a little wider.
yeah. And now the real like evolved thought process is that your feet don't have to be even necessarily.
That's
So
right.
they could be like a little staggered if you needed them to be. One could be forward, one could be out. Because if our bodies are, we know that our bodies are inherently asymmetrical, so we don't have to fit our bodies square peg round hole. We can just
Yeah.
was that right, or round peg? No, square peg round hole. We don't have to do that. We can just, however, whatever feels best is what we should take. We don't have to artificially impose this symmetrical stance.
Because,
So
right.
anyway, there anything goes more or less. I mean, it still has to be within reason, but
Right,
uh
right. It still needs to
there,
look like a squat, like be in that
yeah, yeah.
movement pattern of a
There are a lot
squat.
of potential ways that you could do it that we
Variations.
would still all call a squat. And I think my guess would be that you would say the same about chair. With maybe a
Uh,
slight bias towards a little bit of a narrower stance than what you would take in a squat.
I think if you're just going to go like classic yoga textbook, like what is chair pose? I agree with you. I don't think it would be as wide as a gym squat, as a strength
Hmm.
squat.
We would call we like maybe the textbook chair pose we would call like a narrow squat.
In the strength world.
Hmm.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. But one thing you made me think of as you were talking about like the different positioning and how your two sides could be different. And like you could have one side maybe toed out a little more than the other. There's that difference as well. But I don't know if well, I'm sure you remember, but I don't know if you were thinking in that moment that we have a video that we made through Strength for Yoga that's on social media that we'll link in the show notes, which is how to find your perfect squat stance,
Mm-hmm.
which is, it's like a super simple, quick tip because, people kind of fret about it. They're just like, well, what do I do? Feet parallel, feet, this, what distance apart? Like, how do I align? And what's the tip that we give in that video?
Yeah, you just jump up in the air, and however your feet land is your perfect squat.
And why is that? Why is just jumping up and landing and you look down and you're like, okay, this is how I should squat? Like, why? Why is that?
It's just magic. No, your
That's
body
one
your body figures
explanation.
out the best way to absorb that force, and yeah,
That's right. Like your body just kind of knows, right? It's like, I'm about to receive all this load of your body landing down. I'm going to arrange myself in a way to absorb that force as efficiently as possible. And
Mhm.
it just kind of naturally knows, like, you don't have to think about it. That's what this whole micromanaging thing we keep talking about is, like, we're trying to override the way that our body naturally self-organizes itself in really efficient manners. We're trying to, in a top-down manner, from like brain down to body, we're trying to decide what we think is best. But in many, many cases, if we just let it be more bottom up and let the body just like decide, and that jump is perfect because the jump and you land, it happens so fast, right? Like it's like a split, maybe it's not a split second, but it's fast. You might know because I know you
Mhm.
time jumps and stuff, but it's
It's just
faster
it's a
than
split second. I think that's accurate.
it's faster than you probably have time to actually consciously think about, like, I'm going to land like this. So instead you can
Mhm.
just trust that it's going to self-organize in that split second. And then you look down and you're like, if my left foot's out at 40 degrees and my right foot's at 30, and they're not, maybe that's just because of my ankle, knee, and hip joint structures and how they may not be the same on both sides. And
Mhm.
I'm just going to go with it. It can be that simple. I think it's an example of how sometimes things don't have to be so complicated. So
Mhm.
conceivably in the yoga world, I mean, you could encourage someone to do that for chair pose. You could, like, that's like one approach, like jump up and land, and that's how you might want to be. But like you said, a squat in the strength world is a little different than chair pose. Generally, chair pose is a little more narrow.
Mhm.
But generally, when I personally tend to teach chair pose, I just am pretty open. Like obviously when we teach poses, there's still a container of the pose. Like I still want you to embody the shape where it's like you're sitting down into a chair. But I'm not going to get too controlling in that sense of all these little alignment details, but more encourage people to embody a position, like a lower body alignment that just feels, I don't know if like stable is a good word or just feels supported, but that just feels like they can move in this like efficient manner that works well for their body, and they don't need to overlay these like
Wow.
objective
So
alignment
so
cues.
would you have someone try out a few
Yeah,
different foot placements, maybe? Like if you were doing a
absolutely.
one-on-one, or I guess you could do that in a
You
class
could do
too.
it. Yeah. So we might try feet together. We might try feet like hip distance, try feet wider for sure. Like let's try them all. And also you could just do that in an exploratory manner too. Like how do
Mhm.
you experience
Mhm.
the loads differently in all of these different
Oh, I
options?
like that.
And yeah, because they are different. Like they are going to target your knees, ankles, and hips differently in those different alignments. Yeah, so just being a little more open about it, like there's still a container to it. It's like we are doing chair pose, we're not doing warrior two right now, so that's not what we're asking for. But within the container of utkatasana chair pose, can you tune into what feels like a good fit for your body? And it certainly might not look like the person next to you, and it certainly not might not look like my chair pose.
Mhm.
um Yes. So yeah, so I think it could just be a little bit open. Oh, I know what I was gonna suggest was one other additional point there was, I guess you could intentionally, for a specific reason in a moment, teach a different foot width. Like maybe we want to teach feet together just in this moment for this purpose. Feet together is inherently going to be a little less stable, like for the body, just so
Mhm.
if the wider the feet are, the more there's stability. So perhaps if you're wanting to layer on some more stability,
I
I
think
just
you
thought,
also need more dorsiflexion.
oh, when the feet are together. Oh, I think you're right.
Yeah. Yeah. Because when you have them wide, it's kind of a complicated biomechanical thing, but
Uh-huh.
to to not fall over, uh you just don't need as much anterior knee translation because your knees can go out.
That makes,
So by
intuitively, that makes sense to me.
bringing them
Yeah.
in, they can only go forward, and in order for you to stay upright and not have your weight go back, then the knees have to go forward.
Makes sense. And what if, for example, one of your goals was ankle mobility? Like, what if you wanted to work on increasing dorsiflexion
Hmm.
range of motion? Maybe that would be a good reason to bring your feet together and then to
Hmm.
really do
Hmm.
this
Hmm.
like knees forward
Totally.
variation. Yeah. So when you layer on actual intention, then that can start to guide maybe how we might suggest alignment in poses in that for those reasons. But again, it's like
Wow. So it's
for that
like,
reason
if
in that
somebody
moment.
said, yeah, if somebody just said, well, what's the right alignment? It's like, well, the right alignment for what and for who?
Exactly. Exactly. Like there really is outside of just the container that we need to look like and embody like we're going to sit in a chair. Like there's that container to it. So there's some right wrong when it comes to that, but beyond once we get into the finer details, there is not an inherent right or wrong. Like in
Hmm.
asking the question, like what's the right alignment for chair pose, that's maybe not even the best question unless you add the context that you're asking about. But if you just ask it like objectively,
Hmm.
Travis, there was one more alignment question that we wanted to include that I think is an important one to include about chair pose, and then maybe we can wrap up our talk about alignment
Yeah.
confusions.
Maybe
And
two
this
more.
one, maybe two more. Okay, let's see how much time we have for time we have. But this one I know comes up a lot, and I've personally experienced people being really confused about this. This has to do with twisting chair pose, where your
Hmm.
hands are in front of your heart, and then you twist and you hook your elbow around your knee or move
Hmm.
towards something like that. So this question comes up a lot. If you were to think of your knees in that position and how they're side by side, the knees are side by side. The question is, when you come into that twist, should you keep the knees flush, like so that they're in this perfect horizontal line, or should you let one knee track forward of the other as you
Hmm.
twist?
Hmm.
If I were twisting to the left, then it would be that right knee that tracks forward. That's kind of how it works.
Hmm.
Like
Yep.
just like in the movement pattern. So you'll definitely find, or I at least definitely find yoga teachers who teach it both ways.
Okay.
Like they very strongly say it needs to be this way or it needs to be this way. So it'll be like, come into twisting chair and now look down at your knees. And you may be instructed to pull that right knee back so that the knees are
Hmm.
flush. Let's just
Hmm.
continue with that twisting to the left example. So
Hmm.
it'll be like, pull the right knee back and keep them flush. Like that's the correct way. And then other teachers will teach, look down and let the right knee shift forward and let them be uneven. And it's like, emphasized as important, like one is the right way and one is the wrong way. Do you have any idea? I have an idea, but do you like just hearing about this difference of it's like seems subtle, right? It's like an inch or two of knee where the knees are placed. Do you have an idea of
Hmm.
why that's emphasized as important in either direction?
My only thinking would be that it's more aesthetic to
Oh
keep the
yeah,
knees even.
like it
Like
looks messy or
what's
something.
natural? Yeah, what's naturally going to happen is that one shifts forward, one shifts back, and people are trying to impose some artificial thing to counteract that.
I think that is certainly one of the reasons for sure. And again, that's coming back probably to the like yoga textbook classic picture approach, which certainly comes into these questions. So I agree with you about that. But there's another reason that also comes in. I wonder what you'll think when I tell you, because I don't think I've told
I
you this
mean,
before.
there's some difference in muscular engagement, but I don't think I
Yeah.
know what you're going to say.
So what I'm going to say is that this actually tends to be taught with regard to twists in yoga in general, but it comes up a lot in twisting chair. But the idea is that if you twist your spine with while keeping your pelvis quote square. So again, all in this
Hmm.
whole paradigm of like straight lines and 90 degrees and square, if you rotate your spine but you keep the pelvis square, many people in the yoga world will say that that can tweak or damage your SI joints, your sacroiliac joints, because if you think about it, the sacroiliac joints are where the sacrum, which is the base, the bottom bone of your spine, that triangular bone, it sits in the pelvis. And if you were to twist your spine while holding the pelvis still, then maybe, I mean, really biomechanically, I don't think this is possible, but the way people think about it is that that rotation in the spine will layer all the way down to the sacrum and the sacrum can twist in the SI joint. And they'll call that like torque, like SI joint. That's going to torque the SI joint and that's going to like jam it and misalign it, pull it out of place and create pain. Does that make sense? So if you apply that to twisting chair, what that is if you come into twisting chair and you keep the knees flush, That's the same
Mm-hmm.
thing as holding the pelvis square.
So
And the
those are
idea
the people who
is,
are saying you should allow
yep,
the natural thing to happen.
that's right. So those people will
Okay.
say in twisting
Oh,
chair, let the knee track forward. And it also
interesting.
is
It's
applied to a
kind of the
lot of other
opposite of what I
twists.
thought. Like they're saying, make sure that that knee goes forward so
Oh,
that you
yeah.
don't jam your SI joint, as opposed to make sure you counteract what naturally happens.
You're
They're
right.
reinforcing what naturally happens, but they're thinking that if you try to counteract, make sure you don't counteract what naturally happens because that'll jam your SI joint.
You're so right. It's like double layered there. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, like they're emphasizing let it be natural, which I think you and I would probably just in
You didn't
general
like if you didn't
encourage
say
that.
anything, then it would just
Yes.
happen. I mean, I guess
Exactly.
there could be somebody coming in and being like, well, shouldn't my knees be equal? Shouldn't my
Right.
pelvis stay whatever?
Right. Well, that's yeah. But in general, the way the body naturally moves and flows through movement is as you rotate your spine, the pelvis is going to turn.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in twisting chair, the knee would come forward.
Mm-hmm.
And in general, we support like just letting that happen. But why layer on this like fear mongering
Yeah.
cue
Yeah.
that can that Travis, do you think that's a
The
likely?
the the good news for people is that the SI joint really doesn't move.
Exactly.
The SI joint I have seen with my own two
Yes.
eyes in the
Yes.
anatomy lab,
Yes.
and there it just it's a very stiff joint.
A
Like
hundred,
you,
super stable, right?
yeah, your twisting chair is not going to de I don't know,
Stabilize.
yeah, destabilize your SI
That's the
joint.
terminology
Takes a
that's
lot
used.
more
What I
blunt
tend to
trauma.
hear about, yeah, I tend to hear that it's like car accident. It's like high trauma,
Right.
high forces that actually could actually injure the SI joint
Not
because it's that
not
stable.
not twisting chair.
Or any twists in yoga. Like I said, this is also applied across the board to
Yeah.
all twists. Yeah. I guess one case for maybe holding the pelvis square, like in twisting chair, one case for keeping the knees flush. And maybe you'd agree or not agree, but I think if you hold the pelvis square, that would direct more of the rotational force directly to the spine. Like I think you could get quote like a deeper twist
Hmm.
if you kept the pelvis, if you didn't let the
Yeah.
pelvis also turn. So if that was a
Sure.
goal, like you really wanted to wring out full rotation of the spine, then
Get
maybe.
that detoxification.
That we all know happens when we twist. It's funny the things, yeah. There's the detox myth when you twist, and then there's the like mess up your SI joint when you twist. There's
Which are
so many
opposite.
claims.
Like we don't want to get too much spinal twist because that'll destabilize your SI joint. But we want a really good spinal twist, so we make sure we get that strong detox.
100%. And in both cases, all of that is just unnecessary to say. We don't need to talk about that stuff because it's not true and we could just let the body twist.
Yeah.
So, do you think this does that address and answer that question, that good question that sometimes comes up about twisting
Yeah.
chair?
Totally.
Now,
So I think either way,
exactly. I think you
do
could,
what
yeah.
feels good to you.
I think
Yeah.
generally, personally, if as I cue that, I don't micromanage the knee placement. Just I want them to get in that shape, of like getting into the twist and however their body
Whatever
needs to
happens.
organize. Yeah,
Yeah.
to approximate that is what's going to happen. So I wouldn't
Yeah.
micromanage it personally. Now,
The last cue that I just wanted to touch on was the weight in the heels.
oh, thanks for bringing that one up. Yeah, so and
Mm-hmm.
that came up in the questions that were submitted to us, and I can personally relate to hearing this a lot. And I used to say it all the time when I
Right. Well,
used to
when you were
teach.
doing
Right.
the weight in the heels goes with the vertical shin hip dominant.
Exactly. And I think maybe that's just what we wanted to explain because I think we got some questions on like, I hear this cue, but what does it mean or why are people
Hmm.
giving it?
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
the counter or the alternative to that would be allowing the weight to come towards the toes or the forefoot,
Hmm.
and that's going to it just having the weight in the heels helps you like find the posterior chain muscles
Yeah.
like
Yes, it
connect you to
does.
those
Yes.
versus the opposite where if you let the weight come forward then it's easier to feel the quadriceps working.
Yeah.
So then the happy compromise between them is feel the whole foot.
A
You know,
hundred percent.
if your foot is a tripod, we say, with your
Yeah.
heel, big toe, and pinky toe, then just try to distribute the weight evenly
Yeah.
as a compromise. You could do it with your weight back. You could do it with the weight
Yeah.
forward. I think in a strength and conditioning context, we often say drive from the heels
Yeah.
because people tend to allow their weight to come forward, and we're trying to counteract that by sending them back to their heels a
Yeah.
bit.
That's a really good point. So maybe, yeah, so in counteracting that forward tendency, or if you had the intention of trying to get people to really feel and connect to the posterior chain,
Yeah.
then weight and heels might be a good cue for that. Like it's not like a bad cue. It's not like don't use it
No, it's
at
good. I
all.
think it's a good cue. Yeah.
Yes, but I
But
think
it's like, well, that's the response to if you see people like leaning too far
yes,
forward with
exactly.
it.
Like right. But the way I used to use that cue in my teaching, which was just always we always did chair pose with the weight in the heels. Make sure your weight's in your heels. Like that was right for everybody,
Mhm.
and I wouldn't agree with that
One cue
anymore.
that I like to create that happy compromise is like make sure you can wiggle your toes. If you can't
Ooh.
wiggle your toes, then your weight might be too far forward.
I really like that, Travis. That's very, and maybe they could even try to wiggle their toes in that moment. It'd
Hmm.
be a cool like
Hmm.
toe mobility opportunity. I
Hmm.
like that. Cool. Thank you for bringing that up because I think that was a great one to touch on as well. But with all of that said, this is going to be super quick. But my final question for you is for people who hate chair pose, which is very many yogis, it's for many, it's like
Hmm.
at the bottom of their list of the poses they like. What could they do to help make their practice of chair pose more easeful and less
What a wonderful
unpleasant?
question.
And maybe you could just give a
So
quick answer.
yeah, we'll rapid fire
Very
here.
quick.
What people usually do is more chair pose, but
Oh,
that
it's
often doesn't.
typically right.
Yeah, that often doesn't work because they still hate it, and it never gets easier. And
That's
the
right.
problem is that you can do chair pose till the cows come home, but you're not actually getting stronger. You're increasing your endurance,
Yeah, as we
which goes
talked
back
about.
to what we said earlier. So if you want to get stronger, so that let's say you want to be able to hold a chair pose for 20 seconds or 5 breaths, like
Mm-hmm.
comfortably. Well, the best way to do that is to do chair pose or squats with added load so that you build strength
Exactly.
so that when you return to your body weight version, it just feels much lighter. So you can
100%
progressively build strength by doing squats with weight
in a
per
strength
rep
context.
in
And
a strength context.
people could do that in any they go to the gym, they could get a personal trainer. One way they could do that is they could do that with us through our Strength for Yoga program, which is all geared specifically toward yogis and the yoga population and like introducing them to strength if they're interested in bringing that into their movement practice. We have a book called Strength Training for Yoga. That's such a great introduction. It's an 8-week program with and then an introduction to all the fundamentals. And we also have an ongoing interactive program called Remote Group Training. And you don't have to get the book before you do that. You could do either, you could do both. But Remote Group Training is like interactive and it changes every month. And we're there to support you and answer your questions. And
Yeah.
yeah, and the links to all that are in the show notes. People who use the code podcast30 can get 30% off their first month in remote group training. So just that's like a cool hookup.
And
And yeah.
we've absolutely heard feedback from people who
Mm-hmm.
we had either a squat or a chair pose month, did we not?
Yes, we did. We did.
So it was
In
a
memory.
month where we still do full body training, like upper body, lower body, core every month.
Yeah.
But each month we have a little bit of a emphasis on one particular strength exercise or yoga pose. And we focused on chair. Well, I guess we called it squats. But anyway,
Right.
what we found was the people said, wow, chair pose I used to hate, or it used to be so hard. And after just 1 month
Mm-hmm.
of doing this chair or squat focused strengthening practice, I no longer hate chair pose, or chair pose is not as hard for me anymore, or it feels more easeful to do chair pose and it doesn't get me like out of my flow as much.
Exactly. They don't hate
So
it as much.
yeah, that is one benefit that one could look forward to by engaging in a regular
Mm-hmm.
strength practice if chair pose is uh you know
Right, a
your
pose that they
nemesis.
struggle with. Yeah, exactly. And it's so true. People had great feedback on that. And of course, we include squats and squat-like exercises in all of our programs. That was just one
Hmm.
particular month where we extra focused on it. But
Yeah.
yeah, so if you're interested in bringing strength into your practice, and helping make your whole yoga practice in general feel more easeful, then, you might consider our Strength for Yoga offering. And with all of that, Travis, I feel like we should probably wrap this up and sign
Bye.
off. I think we did a great job covering a chair pose and all these different facets. Thanks for sharing all of your knowledge
Oh,
from all of your
thank you.
experience and, your exercise
Yeah,
science knowledge.
it's fun to compare when there's such a apples to apples or
Yeah,
green apples to red apples
so much overlap.
comparison between the yoga poses and the strength exercises.
Absolutely. So thank you so much. I hope our listeners benefit from this conversation. It was educational.